Marcus Sanzi is a master's degree student in a counseling psychology program at Simon Fraser University. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a master's degree in psychosomatic medicine from the Faculty of Health Science of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He is developing an LGBTQ protocol and guidelines for milieu, children, and family counseling services, and has previously worked with AIDS Vancouver as a health promotion case manager for gay and bisexual men. In his thesis project, Marcus is investigating how masculinity ideologies shape the interpersonal relationships amongst gay men.
Sorry, I'm not very smart technology.
You just have to go here. I don't know why it doesn't. Okay, yeah. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. As you heard, my name is Marcus, and I'm the grad student at SFU. I'm going to be presenting the reflection of my literature review and for my master's thesis. So this is my research question: how do feminine Latino gay men make meaning of the resistance to their effeminate identification within the gay community while seeking relationship? This question is the topic of my research and the foundation of my presentation to you today. So I will be walking through these points during my presentation. However, due to the time constraint, I will only be able to present the highlights of the findings in the gender role identification topic. But if anybody wants to know more about the other topics, please feel free to email me. So why are faggots so afraid of faggots? This provocative question is the title of Sinkmore's book, in which several essays explore the position of gay men in a straight conformity behavior where the disassociation from effeminacy is seen as the ultimate marker of gay success. Both activists and scholars are steering the attention to this increasing phenomenon of peer discrimination, where some even suggest a relationship between negative feelings towards homosexuality and their incorporation of heterosexual privilege that mainly supports the assumptions and promotion of heterosexuality as a norm. So since the middle of the gay liberation movement, an emphasis on hypermasculine gay men commenced in Western cultures. Today, as noticed by activists, gay men see feminine traits as negative, and most of them are filling their online profiles with derogative statements as no femmes, or mask for mask, and even calling themselves straight-acting dudes, as if being heterosexual is the same as being more masculine. So this avoidance attitude has impacted feminine gay men's mental health deeply. And yet, this issue is especially pronounced in Latin America culture, where feminine gay men face a cultural norm of masculinity. Researchers need to expand their scientific efforts to further comprehend the significance of masculinity within the Latin culture that examines the multiple and intersecting dimensions of gender, race, ethnicity, culture, class, and migration. This is particularly important when it comes to the struggles faced by feminine Latino gay men in Canada. Accordingly to Statistics Canada, the number of Latin American immigrants in Canada is rising. In fact, Canadians of Latin America origin constitute one of the largest non-European ethnic groups in this country. Latino gay men face exceptional challenges of racism, discrimination, and development in a predominantly white gay community where they are pressured to successfully navigate two or more identities in an environment they are not fully accepting of either. Not only is race a concern, but also the position that Latin societies place on gender as an important constituent of sexual identity. Thus, the migration process and the resistance from some scholars to consider homosexuality in a more informed fashion has added to the understanding of occurrence of HIV infections in this population. Consequently, it is reasonable to think that their interracial relationships are filled with uncertainties and tensions. This is why the objective of my literature review is to explore the research that does exist on the relationships between masculine machismo and anti-effeminacy among Latino gay men. So in order to obtain relevant literature in the field, I conducted a systematic database search that focused on studies conducted between 2000 and 2016. I used a combination of keywords, such as those that you can see on the slide, and that they are related to the topic, so I could find the most relevant studies. From there, I developed an inclusion criterion based on the initial findings, and I looked at the methods sections to evaluate the studies of this criteria. The concept of machismo in the third criterion was borrowed from the La Cancella. Finally, I used the concept of gender nonconformity, borrowed from Bailey and Zucker. And once all the studies had been read, compared, and coded for major findings, I re-examined them, the codes for specificity. A final sample of 53 relevant articles were retrieved during this process and placed into three key themes. So gender identity, sexual role in HIV, and mental health. So this is the snapshot of the studies on the category of gender role identity. And here is the snapshot of the studies on the category of sexual role in HIV and mental health. And once again, I'm not going to be able to talk about those, so if anybody wants to hear more, feel free to email me. So gender and the concept of masculinity and femininity are always relational and includes a complex mix of beliefs, behaviors, and characteristics. They are socially determined. Patterns of masculinity are socially defined in contrast to some sort of femininity. These constructs create gender dichotomies and power differential where heterosexuality and masculinity are privileged. This act of favoring heterosexuality expresses that heterosexual bodies, subjects, norms, and practice are always articulated and naturalized in relation to a non-normative gender and sexualities and queer ways of life. This practice legitimizes heterosexual expressions also in a moral sense, defining what is within the bounds of norm. All of that compasses what is known as heteronormativity. Within heteronormativity lies hegemonic masculinity. It centers the attention on practice that promotes the dominant position of man. The concept of hegemonic masculinity was used by many scholars in numerous studies, as well in the development of several instruments to evaluate gender roles. With similar concepts, other key scholars in this theme developed scales that specifically measure machismo. So using one of those scales, the GRCS, Alt found that gay men were more likely to see themselves as different type of men than heterosexual, because homosexuality is often perceived as a violation of the hegemonic masculinity. This shared experience of othering could strengthen the bonds between gay men, but unfortunately, they tend to pass off their inherent discrimination to feminine gay men within the gay community. Also, using the GRCS, Sanchez found that single men reported more concern over being affectionate with other men in comparison to partnered men. The researchers suggest that demonstrating feelings is associated with feminine traits and not an attractive feature for gay men, single gay men. Gender stereotype was also observed as a central to gay men's body image. Sanchez found that among gay men, gender roles are based on masculinity and femininity stereotypes. Sadly, gay men in this study view masculinity ideals as fundamental for self-worthiness. Evidence of masculine norm pressuring gay men to develop an ideal body was also reflected on the participants' narratives. Sanchez surveyed 622 self-identified gay men and found that 55.1% of participants stated that appearing masculine is important, whereas 70.3% wish to be more masculine than feminine, suggesting a considerable abnegation of feminine traits of self-image. Moreover, the study suggests that those who are more worried about violating traditional masculinity ideals feel more negatively about being gay than those less concerned. Recently, Sanchez found that masculinity looks and behaviors were important for both Latino and non-Latino gay men. However, Latino gay men are slightly more conscious about what masculine and heterosexual behaviors they present in public than non-Latinos. Estrada found a positive correlation between the endorsement of traditional notions of machismo and internalized homophobia. The study found that traditional machismo was positively associated with involuntary belief and expressions of hostility against gay men. Avelar described that the narrative of 3 foreign-born men who migrated to Canada and found that sexual role has substantial social and identity implications in Latin America culture. Men in this study reflected a common belief in Latin America societies that gay men must be feminine and female acting. Thus, men in receptive role endure more negative social consequences than men in insertive roles. Another Canadian study unpacked the myth that LGBTQ community in Canada is racially integrated by exposing discourses of inclusion and exclusion based on non-white features as preferences for sexual interaction. One participant went on to explain that more than just a selective process, this preferred action privilege a non-rationalized currency of erotic capital, reflecting practice of discrimination that is embedded in social constructions. Similarly, in a US study, Morales noticed that this selective process on the participants' narratives as they were often perceived as exotic and stereotyped as the Latin lovers, particularly in social settings. As a result, being perceived as unusual only contribute to rejection on the basis of ethnicity, and unfortunately is a common theme experienced by Latino gay men in Canada. Lipa found that Hispanic and Asians showed large homosexual heterosexual differences in assessed gender-related traits than did white. This quantitative study indicated that cultures where gender is intensively differentiated, gay men tend to assume more feminine roles. More recently, a study found that cultural stereotypes, interpersonal perceptions, and individual self-label merge to characterize Asian men as feminine bottoms and Black men as masculine tops. They even found evidence to support that racial minority individuals tend to self-identify with specific sexual roles. Along similar lines, literature has shown that heteronormative ideal is also important in Latin America culture. A quantitative study that investigated the factors that influence masculinity ideology among Latino men found support for the claim that Latinos tend to conform with traditional masculinity ideology when they are strongly involved with their ethnic group, social customs and traditions. This compliance with masculinity ideology, with the addition of a homophobic harassment, forced many Latino gay men to migrate. These men describe a sense of insecurity and violence against them, exacerbating a sense of vulnerability. Some even explain that expressing emotions can signal other men about their sexual orientation and place gay men at risk of violence. This hostile environment forces Latino gay men to conform with heteronormative instances and conceal their homosexuality, impacting their feasibility to express emotions. Masculinity ideology also pressures Latino gay men to act masculine, to avoid oppression and discrimination because of the state or quality of being feminine. Maintaining a normalized masculinity is one form of decreasing marginalization. It is challenging for Latino gay men to accept gay men's feminine traits when they are immersed in a culture and society that promotes heterosexuality exclusively and ridicules non-conforming individuals. Experience of discrimination not only leads to isolation, but also increase the pressure to conform with heteronormativity and masculinity. But enhances the adverse perception, intolerance, and stigma that participants had towards themselves, adding to the culture of self-hatred. There is evidence in the literature that Latino gay men witness derogatory language and mockery of gay men's behavior from older men in their family when they are living in their countries. Basically, parents with homophobic language contribute to the internalization of homophobia by their kids, as the messages shape their kids' own value systems regarding sexual minorities and define their belonging. This coping mechanism and the necessity of being accepted contribute to experience about gender, contribute to the experience about gender policy. These norms are based on a model of masculine role that they are forced upon them, and eventually fuel the internal struggle to accept themselves and any other person who express different gender roles than traditional ones. The culture of homophobia, the emphasis on heteronorms, and the importance of masculinity is even present on Latino boys' construction of gender identities. An ethnographic study involving middle school students found that hegemonic masculinity is overtly reinforced with collectivenesses. The narratives of masculinity were conveyed verbally and non-verbally in order to define manhood. The usage of homophobic discourses has the intention to regulate one another's gender performative and act more masculine. The idea of masculine performance or straight acting seems to be important not only for Latinos, but generally to gay men. A grounded theory study found that gay queer college men referenced the necessity of abnating effeminate traits. The participants found to be attractive what is actually defined as masculine. Another study showed that acting a little far from the masculine expectancy often prompts suspicion about their sexual orientation, and this pressure gay men to be vigilant and act masculine in order to avoid any sissy or flamboyant traits. So the literature implies that ideology about masculinity determine specific behaviors and contribute to discrimination. These ideologies strongly influence the understanding of gender roles and promote hostility against effeminacy. Fundamentally, being masculine is associated with good virtues, whereas feminine traits must be avoided. In the lives of a gay man, this binary standpoint simply reinforces heteronormative framework and promotes gender roles by association, categorizing masculine men as tops and feminine men as bottom. Furthermore, views of traditional masculinity are responsible for those gender assumptions, forcing gay men to face social disapproval and excessive masculinity traits in order to make them feel accepted or even normal. Normal is, in this sense, is to endure the patterns of masculinity and avoid effeminate qualities. Noticeably within the gay community, these assumptions extend to other forms of suppositions where race and ethnicity can signal gender roles and sexual preferences. Indeed, the categorization is that Black are tops, Asians are bottoms, and Latinos are exotic and lovers. In fact, this categorization is nothing more than masquerading its real intention, discrimination. Gay men are pressured to conform with heteronorms mostly inherent in society's constructions of gender roles. In some Latin cultures, the effeminate roles demoralize men, and it's arduous for this population to accept feminine men and homosexuality. Homophobic harassment and violence become a vivid reality for Latino gay men, forcing them to seek masculine appearances and behaviors to compensate any clue about their sexual identity that one might flag as gay or even feminine. Besides general violence, hate crime, assaults, and even murder, those issues faced by feminine gay men in Latin America every day. This social culture production forces many Latino gay men to migrate as well as internalize homophobia. The constant avoidance of effeminacy is not only a protective factor, but also a culture heritage. Although migration is a way to find peace and sense of citizenship, many of these men face a new adaptation challenges that includes homophobia, racism, poverty, and most importantly, the new subordinated rules of masculinity of the Western white gay males in North America. It is important to note, however, that these studies were not without their flaws. Little empirical data on the interaction of feminine Latino gay men living in Canada suggests that this dual minority population is still somewhat invisible or marginalized. Therefore, understanding how feminine Latino gay men make meaning of the resistance to their feminine identification within the gay community is relevant and necessary. Examining the nexus of masculinity and femininity, particularly as understood within the Latin culture, might provide a more effective way to reduce stigma and prejudice against gay men. Thank you. That was a lot.
Is there any question for Marcus?
No, please.
So Marcus, what's the next step with your work?
So now I'm looking at methods to do a qualitative research. So I'm looking to explore those questions with either photo voice or using some ethnographic techniques and grounded theory.